Hi everyone, I'm Andia, the Head of International Structuring at Domicile Attorneys, and today we are here with Tasneem from Newform Foods. She's going to tell us a little bit about their business and expanding their business operations and starting up offshore. Hi Tasneem.
Hi.
So nice to have you here.
Yeah, excited to be here. I mean, it's been a long journey, but we're glad we're almost at the end of it.
Reaching that line. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Newform Foods, about the business and about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm co-founder and COO, so I'm mostly on the operations side, but my background's in finance and strategy, so I've got kind of a more general business background. When we founded, me and my business partner, Brett, Newform Foods was actually called Mzansi Meat. Part of that was really wanting to be a regional player in the alternative protein space. When we started, we were the first ones in Africa, and I think for us that was quite exciting, being a regional player, being very South African, doing something for the African market. But I think as we've kind of progressed, we've really started to think about what does it look like to actually expand what we're doing, and that's currently where we're at, looking at this international expansion in the UK.
Awesome. So, start of question, how did you find Domicile Attorneys?
I think Domicile's got quite a prolific name out there. I think for most people who've interacted with law firms, you kind of get the sense that the bigger that they are, the more money you're spending. And I think we went on this journey. We've got a law firm that does a lot of our day-to-day work, and we had to also go through a process of finding the right lawyers. I think some of the bigger firms for where we are just didn't match our size and what we were looking for, and definitely not from a price perspective. And so we obviously went on this journey to find the right law firm for us for what we were doing day to day. And then over time, I think a lot of the conversations with our investors and other stakeholders was gearing us towards what does it look like when we get bigger and internationalize, and started looking at where that would be. Domicile was one of the names that came up through our network. I think we know quite a few people that have either interacted from like a business perspective or people that have worked there before, actually, which is quite useful. I think Domicile came up top from in the startup phase for what you're looking for. And I think obviously it is quite bespoke kind of work. And through many stakeholders kind of landed on Domicile. We did do a lot of research and still kind of landed on
gravitated
towards Domicile for a few reasons.
Okay, awesome. And what made you decide to initiate your offshore structure and kind of start expanding?
A lot of it was push and pull factors. I think we're an R&D focused company at the moment, which requires a lot of external investment, a lot of CapEx, and unfortunately, we're not revenue generating. And so everything we do is either VC funded. Initially, it was first angel investment. That was local investors, but also international investors. And as we've needed to raise more, the question has kept coming up, well, what is our exit strategy? What does it look like when we need to raise things like a Series A, Series B? And it just didn't look like it was feasible to only do that in South Africa. And so that started our journey probably 12 to 8. I mean, since we started, people were talking about exits, which I think is it's a bit premature, but I get the gist of it. For a lot of people, they want to actually see the value creation when they're actually investing in the company. And probably 2 years ago, started thinking about what does it look like for us. So being this kind of small company only in South Africa, we really needed to think about where were we going to raise more funds from, where do we want our IP to sit, and actually what is appealing to investors. We looked at the US. It didn't really make a lot of sense to us. I mean, for many reasons. None of us really were based there. Our ecosystem and network wasn't really there. And most of the investors we started talking to were more European, UK. I think the benefit of being in the UK is that there's just similar cultures in a lot of ways, easy to get to. And for us in our industry, the cultivated meat industry, there's a lot more grant funding. And so there were many reasons why the UK made sense. The reasons for internationalizing was also, I think, the only way for us to really expand and truly get the growth capital we needed. And so kind of got pushed in that direction, but I think we are better for it.
Yeah. And now you've set up in the UK, you've got your mirror company there. How often have you gone up to the UK since you've since we've implemented the structure?
Since we've implemented it, so just maybe for like our process, we
Yes.
registered our company only in December 2023. We worked on the documents and probably only finalized most of them between March and April. So it's still very, very new. So we've only traveled once. We've been between May and June. We spent, Brett, my co-founder, and I spent about 3 weeks there, starting initial setup of some of the networks that we've kind of been meeting virtually, but meeting in person, thinking about what infrastructure we need there, types of talent we need there, and some investor conversations. So we've laid some of the groundwork. Our aim is to ideally make it there at least one more time this year, but over the next 12 months, once a quarter. If not sooner, one of us will move there, but that's a very funding dependent.
That's a funding dependent next step.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. And what have you found has been most challenging about implementing your offshore structure? I know you've mentioned, maybe having someone on the ground in the UK, having to fly over now in the interim. Has anything else kind of cropped up through this implementation phase?
I think for us, we had been around for 4 years. So we had started in 2020. And by the time we had kicked this process off, we had a fully established business. And I think there's a lot of complexity that comes with that because we're an R&D focused company. We already had IP. And I think it adds a layer of complexity and time to actually execute. I mean, one of the main reasons we needed to get it done at a certain time frame was that we had an initial investment that was coming in. And so I think the challenge is just the timing it takes to actually get these things set up. For me, and people had talked about it for a long time, doing it earlier, and I could see the benefit. It does cost money. So I think there's also a trade-off between how much are you willing to spend now versus the potential upside at a later stage. And we obviously waited a while before we actually executed this. We were waiting for a forcing function, which was an investment coming in. But I think if we had done it sooner, maybe we would have been able to execute sooner. It's difficult to say. I think for us, it's been helpful. We've been in a UK government program. And so it's called the Global Entrepreneurs Program. And they have helped at least have a softer landing. I can imagine if we didn't have access to certain UK government resources, there would be more challenges. So I've been quite grateful for the fact that we've got a network of support that's kind of helped us smooth things out. I'm not saying it's easy.
No, made the landing a little bit softer.
I mean, the exchange rate hurts a lot.
When you're working in pounds. Yeah, I can imagine it's not ideal.
Yes, exactly.
But you were just talking about the Global Entrepreneur Program. What support have they offered you that's made this a little bit easier?
I think some of the initial kind of process that you need is actually setting up the company. And some of that is self-explanatory and easy, but some of that sometimes you just want to check with someone. So there is always a resource that we can touch base with when we're confused about certain elements. We've definitely, when we struggled with things like a bank account and setting up an initial address, what's the right thing or wrong thing to do, they have support that is government related, which is helpful because it means that they will give you advice that is like legally sound, and actually
compliant.
Compliant is the right word.
Yeah.
And so that's been super, super helpful from the very small menial things, but have massive impact. And then we've also got almost like a mentor there. So we've got someone who's kind of catering towards our needs. We're looking for investors and different partnerships in the food space. And so we've been connected with a mentor who is employed by the government, but is actually there to support us, to introduce us to people on the ground.
Which facilitate like these meetings and networking and hopefully kind of just almost fast track expansion in a way, facilitate that fast track.
Yes, exactly. And I think their aim is like, how do you give them the softest landing possible? And this is like this network of people. If we're struggling with something, one of them is like, we're looking at grants in the UK. There's someone that we can contact that'll support us and linking us to the right kind of investments essentially.
Okay. Great. I think that's very helpful because I can imagine that the whole process is very overwhelming. It's a lot of information to take in. It's a lot of things to consider. And you can feel like you're drowning. So if you have someone who's just lifting you up a little bit, keeping your head above water, it can make a big difference.
No, exactly. I think just it's been helpful to just have someone who we can kind of, bend someone's ear about something.
Awesome. What have you found has been most beneficial of having an offshore company?
I think for us, I'm South African. I love that we've set up the company here when we started. I love that there is technology being built on this continent. But I do think from an investor sentiment perspective, there is a lot of apprehension to invest larger amounts in more innovative spaces in Africa. And so I think for us, just even having the fact that we have a structure set up has opened the door for conversations a lot more than probably when we were just a South African company. So that's, I think, one just immediate effect. Yeah. I think secondly, it's opened the doors for an ecosystem that doesn't exist here. We're the first ones in Africa doing this. There are very few companies that are working in this space. In the UK, there are so many more companies. And so access to more innovation that can accelerate our innovation has been super helpful. More and more people, when we say we are from the UK or will be in the UK, are more willing to collaborate because it's easier.
Yeah.
Not because there's negative sentiment towards us, but it's just easier because we have a structure there and can facilitate things on that side. And so I think it's been really helpful to get the pros that are in South Africa and also the pros that are there in the UK. And so it's just access to better resources and more resources, let me rather say, and more infrastructure.
More people, also maybe more funding. Like you said, investor sentiment's a bit different when you've got a company in a more established jurisdiction, for the lack of a better word, but that they're more comfortable investing in. It kind of facilitates funding trickling through to South Africa. And then I think also ultimately growth here, right? It's not like it stays in your offshore company. It does kind of fund the operations on the ground in South Africa. Cool. And if you could go back in time, would you do anything differently? And if so, what would that be?
I think we would have done it sooner.
Okay.
I think I'm learning a lot now about how much funding exists. I mean, we're primarily driven by external funding. How much funding existed, we would have established relationships there much sooner. We probably would have, been a bit further along in some parts of the journey. Hindsight's 2020. Yes. So it's like, I don't necessarily have regrets, but I think for other companies thinking about going in this direction, I would say do it sooner rather than later. It's never technically too late. I presume there's always probably ways to go about. You probably structure things a bit differently. But I think if we had done it sooner, we probably would have been able to accelerate some parts. I think the big trade-off for us was how much money do we spend now doing it versus later? And is it actually going to have that benefit? And I think a lot of people who have invested in our space were mostly pulling us towards the US, and there's less funding for us, or less applicability in the US. And so I think that also was one of the reasons we didn't move as quickly on it. We wanted to be sure on the jurisdiction we were picking. So I think there was reasonable justification as to how much time we took to make the decision. But if I had known the UK and I had known more about it, we could have probably moved quicker.
And I guess it's a bit of a trade-off, right? Like you said initially, it's do we fund growth or do we fund legally setting up offshore? Yeah. Like what are our immediate needs? And it's when do you pull that trigger? It's just trying to establish when is the best time to go, great, now we've got enough funding, we've grown enough in South Africa, let's start expanding offshore. It's a bit of a tricky one, I imagine, because it's costly. It's a reluctant expense sometimes, but also necessary if you want to open doors to new investors.
Exactly. No, I think that's the thing. If we had an infinite amount of resources, we would have made different decisions, but we didn't. Yeah. And I think like the Rand goes further here. And so the decisions we made were ultimately, they led to better kind of output and R&D because we could make it go further here. And I think now at the stage we are, which is in need of more growth capital, it makes sense to be in the UK where we can access more of it.
Awesome. And what would your advice be? Now, this is a very general question. I appreciate that because everyone in the startup world has their own product and their own business. But what would your advice be for startups who are looking to set up an offshore structure?
I think you've got to be clear on the intention. Why exactly are you doing it? I think a lot of people are pushing for it in different ways. I think for us, we are externally funded, mostly internationally funded, and need a lot of capital. It kind of makes sense to be in an international jurisdiction. I think other companies may not need that or are not looking to access international markets, and maybe that isn't the right direction for them, or maybe there are better jurisdictions for them. I would say be clear on the intention and what you're trying to achieve. I think the other thing is make sure to do it properly, because I think there's lots of ways to do it this incorrectly, and that will really bite you later on. But I think talk to as many people for your need and purpose and figure out if it's the right move for you.
And just coming back to jurisdiction, I think that's such a key thing. It's like, how do you pick the jurisdiction? You know, you were initially pulled to the US, landed in the UK, and of course, you know, there's R&D specific things there. But what would your advice be when you're looking at setting up offshore, where to set up for people who are interested? What factors would you take into account?
I think for us, we were thinking about where is the business going. Again, we're mostly externally funded. So one of the key factors was where's most of our funding going to come from? Is it going to come from the US market? Is it going to come from the UK? Or is it going to be a general international investor base? And then who are the people more likely to go for which one of those jurisdictions? I think we landed on the UK because I think it was a more established jurisdiction that even if we got US or other investors, it still would be okay. We went for the UK based on closer, easier to get to. We've got an established business. We're not going to be moving our staff. We still need to keep some core operations here. How easy is it for Brett and I to get over to actually do what we need to do from a compliance perspective and building the business internationally perspective? And so that was quite key for us. It was distance, really. Language and culture was quite critical for us for what we were trying to build. And I think the other thing was for our industry, what also made sense. Europe kind of probably hits all of those factors as well, but we didn't choose anywhere in the EU for the simple fact that from a industry perspective, regulations is quite difficult in the EU. And so UK is more favorable and will move quicker than the EU for what we need in our industry, and therefore have put a lot more funding behind, grant funding and public funding behind the industry, which works in our favor. And so those were our reasons. I think there are other reasons to go to other regions. If we were already revenue generating, we probably would have considered where we're actually going to be selling more from. I think the commercial aspect would have played more of a role. Not to say that this isn't playing a role. We are considering what our market is from a B2B perspective, which is also an international market, but it's more influenced by the industry and the appetite for the industry as opposed to other factors.
Cool, thank you. And lastly, if you could pinpoint something, what would you say was like a key takeaway during this whole process? Whether it's something that you didn't expect to prop up and it did, and maybe you know, like you say, hindsight's 2020, like maybe if you had insight into that, it wouldn't have been so challenging, or like just something that kind of stands out for you.
I mean, for me, I do appreciate legal work. I mean, I'm like an accountant by trade, so I know that sometimes people devalue certain professions. You know, things are easier and you can Google things. I think for me, it was quite enlightening to also see how much complexity goes into being compliant. There's some people that I know who are also setting up structures elsewhere, and I think they've not even given a consideration to actually being compliant. You know, anyone can set up an entity in the UK. I'm not living there, Brett's not living there. We could set it up and we could say we have this entity and just start taking funds. And I think, obviously, we're 4 years in, so we kind of understand that probably that there was something going to be wrong with just starting to operate another business.
It might come back to bite you a little bit.
But I do think, I think I wasn't as aware of how much needed to go into the fact that we had a business that was already 4 years in to ensure that they could serve the objectives that we were trying to serve. And I think it was just more an appreciation for what needs to go into something like this after you've actually spent so much time building something in one jurisdiction already.
Yeah, how to kind of get that value across to a degree to your new company in a compliant way that doesn't devalue your company if it's ever interrogated. So just to end off on like a final note, how did you find going through this experience with Domiso Attorneys as legal counsel and setting up your offshore structure?
I thought it was quite a collaborative experience. I mean, obviously, I don't have the legal background, so collaborative is very different in this sense, but I thought it was very different to experiences. We had obviously approached other law firms and done some, level of due diligence on where we wanted to go and figuring out what jurisdiction and how we wanted to do it, and then essentially which firm do we want to go with. We landed up picking Domiso, I think, mostly because it has a relatively easy to understand package. So I thought it was like packaged as something that is like, this is the thing you want to do. You do an initial workshop and you understand exactly what your journey will be. And I think with a lot of the other firms, I think some of them would get there, but it wasn't as clear what that approach looked like. I think what we were quite excited was we had known a lot of people that had gone through the process with Domiso. And so we had also had insight as to, they're saying this is their process. Is it actually how it pans out? I mean, we chose it because the answer was obviously favorable in that direction. But then I think in doing that, I think there was always consistency in the communication. It was always clear where we were and where we were progressing. I think we were under a lot of pressure to get it done by a certain date. And I understand that these things don't always have exact time frames. But I think what was really helpful about working with Domiso, who has a more, I would say, more integrated approach, was that we were able to always communicate with that and also kind of see how we could accommodate our needs as much. It was always about what we needed versus necessarily just doing the thing. And I think that was always quite helpful. It felt like we were doing this together as opposed to, here's the thing that we're paying for you to do. And like,
here's an instruction, you go off and you do this.
Yes.
And then let us know when it's done.
Yeah.
It was more...
I felt like we were on the journey together, which I think was quite important for us. Initially also why we chose, I think, Domiso for that approach.
Cool. Thank you. That's high praise, I think. Tasneem, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and to talk to us about your experience. It has been great hearing how we've supported you through this, how you've found the whole process, and also just most excitingly that we've executed and we're on a great trajectory. So to hopefully doing some more funding rounds together in the future.
Hopefully there's lots more money coming our way.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you.